Drake. What you are seeing is the largest single enforcement action ever recorded on Mexican soil. Hundreds of federal operators, backed by armored convoys and medevac helicopters, have dismantled
The forgotten truth behind the Carmel Indian cabins, the lost tribe of the Appalachian Mountains. Death is supposed to be the one thing you cannot fake. That is what I believed during my 18 years as an insurance fraud investigator, tracking down staged accidents and fabricated claims and all the desperate schemes that people devise when they need money badly enough to lie for it. Death is final, I told myself. Death leaves evidence. Death can be verified through autopsies and dental records and DNA analysis and all the other tools that modern forensics has developed to separate truth from deception. I was wrong about that, just as I was wrong about so many things before I discovered what was hidden in the hills of southern Ohio. The community that had spent more than a century perfecting the art of making people die without actually killing them. I am writing this now because my investigation was buried, my evidence was destroyed, and the people who held me captive are still operating, still accepting clients, still staging deaths that fool coroners and insurance companies, and grieving families who never realize that the person they mourned is actually alive somewhere, living a new life that was purchased with their tears. My name is Victor Crane. I was a senior fraud investigator for a consortium of insurance companies based in Columbus, Ohio, specializing in suspicious death claims that exceeded certain thresholds or that displayed patterns suggesting fabrication. My job was to find the truth behind claims that seemed too convenient, deaths that happened at exactly the wrong time for beneficiaries who seemed exactly wrong to be collecting large sums. I was good at my work, known for a tenacity that had exposed frauds ranging from simple faked accidents to elaborate schemes involving multiple participants and fabricated evidence. I had saved my employers hundreds of millions of dollars over my career, and I believed that my work served a larger purpose, protecting the integrity of the insurance system that allowed families to plan for tragedy and businesses to manage risk. When I was assigned in the fall of 2020 to investigate a death claim that seemed routine on its surface, I did not understand that I was about to discover a fraud so vast and so deeply rooted that exposing it would prove impossible. The case that began my education involved a man named Harold Zimmerman, a 53-year-old accountant from Dayton who had apparently drowned while fishing alone on a small lake in Highland County. His body had been recovered 2 days after he failed to return home, found floating in shallow water near his overturned canoe. The death had been ruled accidental by the local coroner, attributed to a combination of cold water and an apparent heart attack that had incapacitated Zimmerman before he could swim to safety. His wife had filed a claim on his life insurance policy, which totaled $2.3 million across policies with 3 different companies. The claim had been flagged for investigation because of the policy amounts and because Zimmerman had increased his coverage significantly just 18 months before his death. The red flags multiplied as I dug into the case. Zimmerman's financial situation had been deteriorating for years, with mounting debts that his accounting practice could no longer cover. His marriage had been troubled, according to neighbors and colleagues I interviewed, with his wife having filed for divorce twice before reconciling under circumstances that no one quite understood. The life insurance policies had been purchased and upgraded in a pattern that suggested planning rather than prudent financial management. And the circumstances of his death, alone on a remote lake on a cold October day, provided no witnesses to contradict whatever narrative the physical evidence suggested. Everything about the case whispered fraud, but I could not find the mechanism. The body had been positively identified through dental records. The autopsy had found water in the lungs consistent with drowning. The coroner had no doubts about the cause of death. Whatever had happened to Harold Zimmerman, it appeared that he had genuinely died. I might have closed the case with a recommendation to pay the claim if I had not noticed a detail that seemed insignificant at first. The lake where Zimmerman had died was located near a community that appeared on maps as Carmel, a small settlement in the hills of Highland County that I had never heard of despite years of working cases throughout southern Ohio. When I researched the community, I found references to a population that had lived in the area for generations, people of mixed heritage who were sometimes called Carmel Indians because of their supposed resemblance to Native Americans, though their actual ancestry was uncertain. The community was described as isolated and suspicious of outsiders, characteristics that were common enough in rural Appalachia, but that caught my attention because the lake where Zimmerman died was on property that belonged to a Carmel family. I began looking for other death claims connected to the Carmel area and found more than I had expected. Over the previous 2 decades, at least 15 death claims had been filed for incidents that occurred within 10 miles of the Carmel settlement. The deaths included drownings, hunting accidents, car crashes, and house fires, all ruled accidental or natural by local authorities, all resulting in substantial insurance payouts. The pattern was not conclusive by itself. Accidents happen everywhere, but the concentration was unusual for such a sparsely populated area. I expanded my search to include deaths of people who had any connection to Highland County, even if the deaths themselves had occurred elsewhere, and the pattern became even more striking. Dozens of deaths over several decades showed connections to the Carmel area that seemed more than coincidental. I brought my findings to my supervisors, requesting authorization for an expanded investigation that would examine the Carmel connection across multiple cases. The response was unexpected. I was told to focus on the Zimmerman case alone, to avoid broader investigations that might create legal complications, and to close the matter as quickly as possible. The instruction felt wrong, a departure from the thorough approach that had always characterized our work, and I began to wonder whether someone above me already knew something about the Carmel community that they did not want investigated. I decided to continue my research quietly, without official authorization, using personal time and resources to pursue leads that my employers seemed determined to ignore. My unofficial investigation led me to former investigators who had looked into suspicious deaths connected to the Carmel area and who had encountered obstacles similar to what I was experiencing. One retired investigator, a man named Charles Bowden, who had worked for a different insurance consortium in the 1990 seconds, agreed to meet with me and to share what he had learned before his own investigation was shut down. What he told me during a 3-hour conversation at a diner in Chillicothe transformed my understanding of what I had discovered. The Carmel Indians, Bowden told me, had been in the death business for more than a century. They did not kill people, not usually, but they specialized in making people appear to die when they actually wanted to disappear. The community had developed expertise in staging convincing deaths, drownings where bodies were recovered, car accidents where dental records confirmed identities, house fires where remains were found in the ashes. The deaths were designed to fool coroners, to satisfy insurance companies, to convince families and creditors, and anyone else who might have reason to keep looking for someone who wanted to be lost. The people who died were transported to new lives, given new identities, and helped to establish themselves far from anyone who might recognize them. The community charged substantial fees for these services, fees that were paid from the insurance proceeds that the staged deaths generated. Bowden had discovered this operation in the early 1990 seconds, while investigating a suspicious drowning that had too many parallels to other deaths in the region. He had developed sources within the community, people who were willing to talk in exchange for promises of protection, and he had assembled evidence that he believed would expose the entire operation. But before he could present his findings, his investigation had been shut down by superiors who cited legal concerns and budget constraints. His evidence had been confiscated and never returned. His sources had gone silent, and one of them had died in circumstances that Bowden believed were not accidental. He had been encouraged to take early retirement, and he had spent the decades since watching the Carmel operation continue, unable to do anything about it. The scope of what Bowden described was staggering. He estimated that the community had staged hundreds of deaths over the past century, generating tens of millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims. The operation had begun in the late 1800s, he believed, when the community had helped people escape from situations that offered no legal exit. Abusive marriages, crushing debts, criminal prosecutions that would result in years of imprisonment. In those days, before modern forensics and computerized records, faking a death had been relatively simple. The community had provided a service that desperate people needed, and they had been compensated for their expertise and their discretion. As the 20th century progressed and forensic science advanced, the community had adapted their methods. They had developed relationships with coroners and medical examiners who could be paid to overlook inconsistencies. They had learned to obtain bodies from various sources, bodies that could be substituted for the deceased when physical evidence was required. They had created networks for establishing new identities, for moving people across the country, for building the documentation that would allow someone who had died to live a normal life under a new name. The operation had become sophisticated enough to defeat most investigations, and the few investigators who had gotten close had been neutralized through various means. I asked Bowden why the insurance industry had not exposed the operation, given the millions of dollars in fraudulent claims that had been paid over the decades. His answer was cynical but convincing. The industry, he said, had calculated that exposure would cost more than continued fraud. Acknowledging that hundreds of death claims had been fraudulent would trigger lawsuits from policyholders who had paid premiums in good faith. It would invite regulatory scrutiny of the industry's investigation practices. It would create public relations disasters that would undermine confidence in life insurance as a product. The industry had decided that paying the occasional fraudulent claim was cheaper than exposing a fraud that would reveal their own failures to detect it. I left my meeting with Bowden convinced that I had discovered something real and determined to pursue it despite the obstacles I would face. I began planning an investigation that would go beyond anything I had attempted before, one that would require me to enter the Carmel community directly and to find evidence that could not be ignored or suppressed. I took a leave of absence from my job, citing personal reasons, and I prepared to immerse myself in the world I had glimpsed through Bowden's account. I did not tell anyone what I was planning, understanding that any leak might alert the community and cause them to conceal whatever evidence I might find. I arrived in Highland County in December of 2020, during the pandemic quieted period when the holidays were approaching and the hills were bare of leaves, exposing terrain that would have been hidden in other seasons. I established myself in a rental cabin about 15 miles from the Carmel settlement, presenting myself as a writer researching the history of mixed-race communities in Appalachia. The cover story was plausible enough to explain my questions without revealing my true purpose, and it gave me a reason to approach community members who might be willing to talk about their heritage, if not about their criminal operations. The Carmel settlement was smaller than I had expected, comprising perhaps 20 or 30 structures scattered along a hollow that wound between hills covered with second-growth forest. The buildings ranged from well-maintained houses to structures that seemed barely habitable, the mix of prosperity and poverty that characterized many rural Appalachian communities. People watched me when I drove through, their attention neither welcoming nor hostile but simply observant, noting the stranger who had entered their territory and would be monitored until he left. I did not stop during my first visits, simply driving through to establish my presence and to observe the layout of the community before attempting any direct contact. My first conversations with community members were carefully limited, focusing on historical questions about the Carmel Indians and their origins. The people I spoke with were guarded but not unfriendly, willing to discuss the general history of their community while deflecting questions that touched on more sensitive matters. They told me about the discrimination their ancestors had faced, about the legal battles over their racial classification, about the strategies they had developed to survive in a society that did not fully accept them. What they did not tell me, what I did not expect them to tell me, was anything about the death staging operation that I believed was the community's primary economic activity. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source, a woman named Loretta Puckett, who had left the community decades earlier and who had settled in Columbus, where I was able to locate her through records connected to one of the suspicious deaths I had investigated. Loretta was in her 70s, bitter about her estrangement from her family, and willing to talk about things that active community members would never discuss. She confirmed everything Bowden had told me and added details that he had not known, information about how the operation actually worked and who was involved in its management. The staging of a death, Loretta explained, was a collaborative effort that involved multiple community members with specialized roles. There were scouts who identified potential clients, people who were desperate enough to consider faking their deaths and who had the resources to pay for the service. There were planners who designed the circumstances of each death, choosing methods that would be convincing given the client's situation and that would minimize the risk of detection. There were technicians who handled the physical aspects of the staging, creating the evidence that would convince investigators that a death had actually occurred. There were document specialists who created the new identities that clients would assume after their deaths. And there were transporters who moved clients from the scene of their staged deaths to the new lives waiting for them elsewhere. The bodies used in stagings that required physical remains came from various sources. Some were purchased from corrupt morgue employees who could provide unclaimed bodies that matched the general characteristics of the client. Others came from natural deaths within the community itself, bodies that were preserved until they could be used in appropriate stagings. In some cases, Loretta admitted, bodies were obtained through means she did not want to describe, suggesting a darker dimension to the operation that went beyond simple fraud. The bodies were prepared to match the expected condition of the client, aged or damaged, as necessary to be consistent with the circumstances of the staged death, then placed where they would be discovered in ways that supported the intended narrative. The fees for the service were substantial, typically ranging from $50,000 to several $100,000, depending on the complexity of the staging and the risk involved. Clients paid in advance, usually through cash or assets that could be liquidated before the staged death occurred. The community took these payments and also received a percentage of any insurance proceeds that resulted from the death, creating an incentive to stage deaths that would generate maximum payouts. The financial structure had evolved over generations, becoming sophisticated enough to handle clients from across the country and to process the significant sums that flowed through the operation. I spent several weeks gathering information from Loretta and from other sources I developed through her connections. I documented everything, creating records that I stored in multiple locations to prevent their destruction if I was discovered. I assembled a dossier that connected the Carmel community to more than 40 suspicious deaths over a 30-year period, deaths that had generated insurance payouts totaling more than $60 million. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, patterns and connections that could not be explained by coincidence and that demanded investigation by authorities with subpoena power and law enforcement resources. My mistake was returning to the Carmel settlement to gather additional evidence that would strengthen my case. I had identified a building that Loretta believed was used to store records of the operation, a structure on the edge of the community that appeared to be a storage shed, but that she said contained documentation going back decades. I planned to photograph the building and its surroundings, establishing its location and characteristics for investigators who would eventually obtain warrants to search it. I did not plan to enter the building or to take any action that would alert the community to my investigation. I was careful, or I thought I was careful, but the community had been detecting and neutralizing threats for more than a century, and they were better at it than I had understood. They took me on a night in late January, intercepting my vehicle on a road I had traveled many times before, and forcing me into a position where resistance was impossible. There were 4 of them, men whose faces I could not see clearly in the darkness, but whose efficiency suggested extensive experience with exactly this kind of operation. They bound me, hooded me, and transported me to a location that I could not identify, a building where I was held for the first of many interrogations that would occupy the following weeks. The man who led my interrogation introduced himself as Elder Calvin Dunbar, a title that suggested his position in the community's leadership structure. He was perhaps 65 years old, with the mixed features that characterize the Carmel population, and eyes that assessed me with the calm intelligence of someone who had handled many threats before and who was confident of handling this one as well. He wanted to know everything about my investigation, what I had learned, who I had spoken with, what evidence I had gathered, who else knew about my work. He was patient and methodical, returning to the same questions multiple times, probing for inconsistencies that might indicate I was concealing information. I told him the truth because I had no reason to protect sources who were already known to the community, and because cooperation seemed like my only hope for survival. The interrogations were conducted over several days, separated by periods of isolation in a small room that might have been a converted storage space. I was fed adequately, treated without physical violence, and given to understand that my fate depended entirely on the community's assessment of the threat I represented. Dunbar explained the community's perspective with a candor that suggested he expected me never to share what I learned. The death staging operation, he said, served people who had no other options, people trapped in situations from which the legal system offered no escape. They helped abused spouses disappear from partners who would kill them if they tried to leave openly. They helped debtors escape from financial obligations that would destroy their families. They helped people with terminal diagnoses die on their own terms rather than languishing through months of painful decline. The service was illegal, he acknowledged, but it was also necessary, filling a gap that legitimate society refused to address. I was given tours of the community's facilities, shown the scope of what they had built over more than a century of operation. The staging capabilities were impressive. Workshops where evidence could be fabricated, storage areas where materials were kept for various types of deaths, vehicles equipped for transporting clients and for creating accident scenes. The documentation systems were equally sophisticated, with records maintained in formats that could be destroyed quickly if authorities ever obtained warrants to search the community. Everything was designed for security and discretion, reflecting generations of experience in evading detection. I was also shown what happened to people who had successfully used the service, case studies that Dunbar presented as evidence of the good the community did. There was a woman who had escaped an abusive husband by staging a drowning and who was now living peacefully under a new name in another state. There was a man who had been facing decades in prison for financial crimes he claimed he had not committed, and who had staged a car accident to avoid unjust prosecution. There were dozens of others, people whose deaths had been the beginning of better lives rather than the end of anything. The stories were selective, I understood, designed to present the operation in the most favorable light, but they were also genuine, representing real people whose lives had been transformed by services that no legitimate institution would provide. My release came after approximately 3 weeks of captivity, following a decision by the community's leadership that I could be managed without being killed. The conditions were familiar from other accounts I had read. Absolute silence about what I had learned. No further investigation, no contact with the sources I had developed, and departure from the region with no intention of returning. Dunbar explained that the community had survived for more than a century by managing threats rather than simply eliminating them when possible, that killing created risks of its own that could be avoided through other means. My silence was enforced not just by threats, but by the knowledge that my evidence had been seized, my sources had been compromised, and any attempt to expose the operation would be my word against a community that had spent generations perfecting its ability to appear innocent. I returned to Columbus and to my job, where I was told that my leave of absence had raised concerns about my commitment and that my position was being restructured in ways that would reduce my responsibilities. The message was clear. My investigation had been noted by someone with influence over my employers, and my career would suffer if I continued to pursue matters that powerful people wanted left alone. Within 6 months, I had been effectively forced out of the industry, my reputation damaged by implications of instability that followed me to every potential employer. The investigation that I had believed would expose a century of fraud had instead exposed only my own vulnerability. I have spent the years since my release trying to find some way to document what I discovered without triggering the consequences that Dunbar promised. I have written accounts that I have stored in secure locations, records that will be released if anything happens to me. I have contacted journalists and advocates who might be interested in the story, though none have been willing to pursue it without evidence that I can no longer provide. I have watched as suspicious deaths continue to occur in and around Highland County, knowing what they mean but unable to prove it to anyone who might act on the knowledge. This account is my final attempt to ensure that the truth survives, even if I do not. I am writing it knowing that publication will likely trigger the response that Dunbar promised, that I may disappear just as so many others have disappeared with the community's help. But I am tired of silence, tired of living with knowledge that should be shared, tired of pretending that my compliance is anything other than cowardice dressed up as prudence. The Carmel Indians are real. The death staging operation is real. The hundreds of people who died over the past century are real, living new lives somewhere while their families mourned and their insurers paid claims for deaths that never happened. The operation continues right now, accepting new clients, staging new deaths, perpetuating a fraud that has grown so large that exposing it threatens institutions that would rather remain ignorant than confront the scope of their failures. If you are reading this and you have the ability to investigate, here is what I ask of you. Do not approach the community directly. They have been managing threats for more than a century, and they will neutralize any direct approach before it can develop into a genuine danger. Instead, follow the pattern I identified. Look for deaths in and around Highland County that generated significant insurance payments, deaths that occurred under circumstances that provided limited opportunity for independent verification. Look for the clients who used the service, people who died, but who may have left traces in their new lives that could be followed by determined investigators. Look for the bodies that were used in stagings, remains that may have been misidentified, and that could be connected to other missing persons through DNA analysis. The operation's greatest vulnerability is the scope of its success. Hundreds of people have used the service over the past century, and not all of them have maintained the discipline necessary to remain hidden. Some have contacted family members despite being told not to. Some have been careless about concealing their continued existence. Some have been identified by acquaintances who encountered them in their new lives and who realized with shock that they were looking at someone who was supposed to be dead. These breaks in the cover stories are rare, but they exist, and each one represents an opportunity to unravel the entire operation. The insurance industry knows about this. That is the most frustrating aspect of what I discovered. The companies that have paid tens of millions in fraudulent claims have calculated that exposure would cost them more than continued payment, and they have chosen to remain silent rather than confront the fraud that has been perpetrated against them. This institutional cowardice enables the operation to continue, providing the financial incentive that sustains the community's criminal enterprise. Exposing the insurance industry's complicity might be the key to forcing action on the underlying fraud. I do not expect this account to produce immediate results. The forces protecting the Carmel operation are powerful, and the evidence necessary to overcome them has been systematically destroyed. But I believe that documentation matters, that truth has value even when it cannot produce immediate action, that future investigators may succeed where I failed if they have access to the information I have preserved. My name is Victor Crane. I spent 3 weeks as a captive of the Carmel death staging operation. I discovered a fraud that has been operating for more than a century, generating tens of millions of dollars in false insurance claims. I escaped, but I could not expose what I found through any legitimate channel. The rest is up to you. The lost tribe is still operating. The deaths are still being staged. The bodies are still being substituted, and the identities are still being changed, and the insurance claims are still being paid. Please do not let them continue forever. Please do something. Please. Before I conclude this account, I want to share specific details about cases I investigated that might provide starting points for anyone who attempts to continue my work. These cases represent the strongest evidence I assembled before my materials were seized, and reconstructing them might be possible through public records that remain accessible. The Harold Zimmerman case that began my investigation remains suspicious despite the apparent confirmation of his death. The body recovered from the lake was identified through dental records, but I learned during my captivity that the community had developed relationships with dental professionals who could modify records to support false identifications. Zimmerman's wife received the insurance payout and subsequently moved to Florida, where she remarried within 2 years. I was unable to locate any evidence of Harold Zimmerman's continued existence, but the speed of his wife's remarriage and relocation suggests foreknowledge that would be consistent with a staged death. A 2015 case involving a woman named Patricia Shelton shows similar patterns. Shelton, a 47-year-old real estate agent from Cincinnati, apparently died in a house fire that destroyed her home and left remains that were identified through DNA comparison with samples obtained from her children. Her death generated $1.8 million in insurance claims paid to her husband, who subsequently sold their remaining properties and relocated to Arizona. What makes the case suspicious is that Shelton had been facing multiple lawsuits related to her real estate dealings, lawsuits that were dismissed after her death and that would have resulted in significant judgments against her estate if she had remained alive to contest them. The fire occurred in Highland County, at a vacation property that Shelton had purchased just 3 years before her death. A 2008 case involving a man named Gregory Morton is perhaps the most troubling. Morton, a 51-year-old physician from Dayton, apparently died in a hunting accident in the hills near the Carmel settlement. His body was found with a gunshot wound to the chest, and the death was ruled accidental, attributed to a fall that caused his own rifle to discharge. The death generated $3.2 million in insurance claims, but what made me suspicious was Morton's professional history. He had been under investigation by the state medical board for prescription irregularities, and he was facing potential criminal charges that would have ended his career and possibly resulted in imprisonment. The timing of his death, coming just weeks before the investigation was expected to produce formal charges, seemed too convenient to be coincidental. I identified at least 40 similar cases during my investigation, deaths that occurred in or near Highland County under circumstances that suggested staging rather than genuine accident or illness. The total insurance payouts across these cases exceeded $60 million, and I believe this represents only a fraction of the community's actual activity over the past century. Many earlier cases would have left little documentary evidence, and many more recent cases may have occurred in other jurisdictions where I did not have access to records. The community's methods have evolved significantly over time, adapting to advances in forensic science and changes in investigative practices. Early stagings relied primarily on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, taking advantage of limited communication between jurisdictions and the general assumption that deaths occurred as reported. Modern stagings incorporate sophisticated evidence fabrication, including DNA materials that can be planted at scenes and dental records that can be modified to support false identifications. The community has invested heavily in understanding forensic techniques so that they can defeat them, and they have developed relationships with professionals in coroners' offices and crime laboratories who can be paid to overlook inconsistencies. The transportation network that moves clients from their staged deaths to their new lives extends across the country, utilizing safe houses and facilitators who are not directly connected to the Carmel community. Clients typically spend several weeks in transitional locations while their new identities are established, and while any investigation of their deaths reaches its conclusion. They are coached on their cover stories, taught to avoid behaviors that might attract attention, and connected with resources that will help them establish themselves in their new lives. The network has been operating long enough that former clients have sometimes become facilitators themselves, helping new clients navigate transitions that they once experienced. The financial flows are managed through mechanisms designed to avoid detection. Client payments are typically made in cash or through asset transfers that cannot be easily traced. Insurance proceeds flow to designated beneficiaries who either keep the funds or transfer portions to the former client through intermediaries. The community's share of proceeds is managed through legitimate businesses that provide cover for the income, making it difficult to distinguish criminal profits from ordinary business revenue. I want to describe my psychological state during captivity and afterward, because I believe it illustrates the effectiveness of the community's methods for managing threats. During the first days of my confinement, I was terrified, convinced that I would be killed and that my body would join the many others that had been used or disposed of in the community's operations. As time passed and I was treated with unexpected consideration, my fear evolved into something more complicated, a kind of respect for the sophistication of what I had discovered, an understanding of the genuine services the community provided to desperate people, a gradual acceptance that my silence might be the most rational response to my situation. By the time I was released, I had almost convinced myself that keeping the community's secrets was acceptable, that exposure would cause harm without producing proportionate benefit, that the people who used the service were generally sympathetic figures whose privacy deserved protection. This psychological shift was intentional, I now understand, a product of how I was treated and what I was shown during my captivity. The community does not rely solely on threats to maintain the silence of former captives. They work to change how captives think about the situation, creating a framework in which silence feels like a personal choice rather than an imposed constraint. Breaking through this conditioning took months, and I am still not certain that I have fully escaped it. There are moments when I question whether publication of this account serves any purpose other than satisfying my own ego, whether the people who use the community's services might be harmed by exposure, whether the insurance fraud that finances the operation is really significant compared to the benefits it provides to desperate people. These doubts are the residue of the conditioning I experienced, and I have to consciously reject them each time they arise. I am publishing this account because I have concluded that the truth matters more than the rationalizations I was taught to accept. Insurance fraud is not a victimless crime. The money paid on fraudulent death claims comes ultimately from policyholders who pay premiums in good faith, from companies whose shareholders bear the losses, from an economic system that depends on honest dealing to function. The people who fake their deaths may have sympathetic stories, but they are still committing fraud, still taking money under false pretenses, still benefiting at the expense of others who played by the rules. The community that enables this fraud is a criminal enterprise, regardless of how it presents itself or how it treats the people it captures. My name is Victor Crane. I discovered the Carmel death staging operation. I was captured, conditioned, and released. I have broken the conditioning, and I am telling the truth. The lost tribe has been found. The deaths have been exposed as frauds. The silence has been broken. What happens next depends on whoever reads these words and decides what to do with them. Please do not let this truth disappear back into the darkness. Please act on what I have revealed. Please. There are additional aspects of the operation that I learned during my captivity and in the years of research that followed, details that might provide crucial leads for anyone attempting to investigate what I discovered. I have hesitated to include some of this information because it involves specific individuals whose identities might be traceable, but I have decided that comprehensive disclosure is necessary for anyone who might pursue the truth. The community's leadership structure was more sophisticated than I initially understood. Elder Calvin Dunbar was one of several elders who collectively governed the operation, each responsible for different aspects of the business. There was an elder who managed client relations, identifying potential clients, and negotiating the terms of their deaths. There was an elder who oversaw the technical aspects of staging, ensuring that each death was convincing and that evidence was properly fabricated. There was an elder who managed the transportation network that moved clients to their new lives. There was an elder who handled financial matters, managing the flow of payments and ensuring that proceeds were properly distributed. This division of responsibilities created a structure that could survive the loss of any single leader, ensuring continuity that had allowed the operation to persist across generations. The recruitment of new clients followed patterns that I was able to partially reconstruct through interviews and research. The community maintained relationships with professionals in positions to identify people who might benefit from their services. Attorneys who represented clients facing impossible legal situations. Financial advisors whose clients were drowning in debt. Doctors whose patients had received terminal diagnoses, and others who encountered desperate people in the course of their legitimate work. These professionals were not direct employees of the community, but rather contacts who were compensated for referrals that resulted in successful placements. The referral network extended across multiple states, though it was concentrated in Ohio, Kentucky, and the surrounding region. The screening process for potential clients was rigorous, designed to identify individuals who were genuinely committed to disappearing and who could be trusted to maintain their cover stories indefinitely. Clients were required to demonstrate that their situations were truly desperate, that legal alternatives had been exhausted, and that they had the financial resources to pay for the service. They were also evaluated for psychological stability, since the stress of maintaining a false death and a new identity could be overwhelming for people who were not adequately prepared. Some potential clients were rejected because they seemed likely to break under pressure, or because their situation suggested that they might eventually want to reclaim their old identities. The preparation period before a staged death typically lasted several weeks, during which clients were coached extensively on their new identities and on the circumstances of their deaths. They learned their cover stories in detail, practicing responses to questions they might encounter, and developing the documentation that would support their new identities. They made arrangements for the disposal of their assets, ensuring that nothing would be left behind that might create complications. They said whatever goodbyes they could manage without revealing their plans, creating the appearance of normal life that would make their deaths seem unexpected. The staging itself was carefully choreographed, with every detail planned to create a convincing narrative. For drownings, the community would select bodies that approximately matched the client's physical characteristics and would place them in water under conditions that would produce the expected forensic evidence. For car accidents, vehicles would be prepared with the client's personal effects and then crashed in ways that would explain the condition of whatever remains were discovered. For house fires, accelerants and timing devices would be used to ensure that the fire burned long enough to consume most evidence while leaving enough for identification. The technical expertise required for these stagings had been developed over generations, passed down from parents to children who grew up learning the family trade. I want to describe in more detail the case of Gregory Morton, the physician whose death I mentioned earlier, because it illustrates the sophistication of the community's methods. Morton had been prescribing controlled substances inappropriately for years, building relationships with patients who were actually drug dealers using his prescriptions to supply their operations. When the medical board began investigating, Morton realized that his career was over and that criminal prosecution was likely. He contacted the community through a referral from an attorney who had represented other clients in similar situations. The staging of Morton's death was planned to appear as a hunting accident, taking advantage of deer season and the remote location where he supposedly died. A body was obtained that matched Morton's general characteristics, though the facial features were deliberately damaged to prevent visual identification. The body was dressed in Morton's hunting clothes, placed with his rifle, and positioned to suggest that he had fallen while climbing over a fence and discharged his weapon accidentally. Morton's vehicle was found at the scene, with his personal effects inside. Dental records had been modified to match the body's teeth, ensuring that forensic identification would confirm the expected result. Morton himself was transported out of the region on the day of his staged death, moving through a series of safe houses before eventually settling in a southwestern state where he established a new identity as a retired businessman. His insurance payout went to his wife, who had been complicit in the plan from the beginning and who later joined him after selling their assets and creating her own cover story for leaving the area. The last I was able to determine, Morton was living comfortably under his new name, practicing medicine without a license for wealthy clients who valued discretion over credentials. The Morton case demonstrates several aspects of the operation that make it difficult to detect and prosecute. The staging was technically sophisticated, incorporating forensic evidence that would satisfy standard investigative procedures. The body used was a real human body that passed all the tests that would normally be applied. The documentation had been prepared by professionals who understood exactly what investigators would look for, and the principals had established their new lives before any suspicion could develop, ensuring that they were beyond easy reach by the time anyone might start asking questions. I also want to describe the community's relationship with the bodies they used in their stagings, because this aspect of the operation troubled me more than almost anything else I learned. The bodies came from various sources, and not all of them were obtained ethically. Some were unclaimed bodies from morgues, purchased from corrupt employees, who falsified records to show disposal through legitimate channels. Some were bodies of homeless individuals, or others whose deaths would not be thoroughly investigated. And some, I came to believe, were obtained through means that amounted to murder, though this was never directly confirmed during my captivity. Elder Dunbar denied that the community killed people to obtain bodies, insisting that their operation was fundamentally different from murder-for-hire services that some criminal organizations provided. But he also acknowledged that bodies were sometimes obtained under circumstances where the original cause of death was unclear, and he implied that the community did not always ask questions that might produce uncomfortable answers. The moral distinction he drew seemed thin to me, a rationalization that allowed the community to see itself as something other than what it had become over generations of increasingly sophisticated criminal activity. The community's self-image was surprisingly positive, despite the nature of what they did. They saw themselves as providing a necessary service, helping people escape impossible situations that mainstream society refused to address. They pointed to clients who had been genuinely helped, abused spouses who would have been killed if they had tried to leave openly, debtors whose families would have been destroyed by financial obligations they could never repay, terminally ill patients who chose to die on their own terms rather than suffer through prolonged decline. These cases were real, and the community used them to justify everything else, including the fraud and the body procurement and the occasional violence that their business required. I have thought a great deal about this self-image, and about whether there is any validity to the community's claims. There are genuine problems in our society that force people into desperate situations from which legal escape is difficult or impossible. Domestic violence victims do face dangers when they try to leave abusive relationships. Debt can be crushing in ways that destroy families and lead to suicide. Terminal illness does impose suffering that some people would prefer to avoid through earlier death. These are real issues that our legal system addresses imperfectly, if at all, and it is true that the community services have provided relief to some people who genuinely needed it. But I have concluded that these genuine services do not justify the operation as a whole. The community has not limited itself to helping sympathetic clients with desperate needs. It has served anyone who could pay, including people whose only desperation was the desire to escape consequences they had brought upon themselves through their own wrongdoing. It has obtained bodies through means that cannot be ethically defended. It has perpetrated fraud that costs ordinary policyholders real money. And it has created an alternative to legitimate legal processes that undermines the rule of law on which all of our rights depend. Whatever good the community has done must be weighed against these harms, and I believe the balance tips decisively against them. The question of what should be done about the community is more difficult. Criminal prosecution would be challenging given the evidence issues I have described, and I am not certain that imprisonment is the appropriate response for people whose crimes include helping abuse victims escape from dangerous partners. But the operation cannot be allowed to continue indefinitely, perpetuating fraud and obtaining bodies through questionable means, and undermining confidence in death investigations throughout the region. Some form of intervention is necessary, even if the shape of that intervention is not obvious. My hope is that this account will spark a conversation about these issues, bringing attention to a problem that has been hidden for far too long, and forcing consideration of how to address it. The Carmel community is not unique. Similar operations almost certainly exist in other isolated communities throughout the Appalachian region and beyond, providing similar services to similar clients. Understanding how one such operation works might provide insights that help expose others, creating a cumulative effect that goes beyond what any single investigation could achieve. My name is Victor Crane. I have told you everything I know about the Carmel death staging operation. I have tried to be honest about the complexities and the moral ambiguities that I encountered during my investigation. I have not claimed that the answers are simple or that prosecution alone will solve the problems that the community has exploited. But I have documented the truth. I have broken the silence that the community depended on. I have created a record that cannot be easily dismissed or destroyed. What happens next is beyond my control. But I have done what I could, and I will accept whatever consequences follow. The lost tribe has been found. The deaths have been exposed. The silence has been broken. May justice be done in whatever form it takes. Please